Thanks for joining us at Uzbekistan's Economic Forum 2021. Our guest today is Martin Blum, economist and ESG ambassador at Raiffeisen Bank International. Martin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me here.
Martin, to start with, let's go through the first round of reforms the country announced about 5 years ago now. What really grabbed your attention at the time, and what really laid the foundation for capital markets to blossom eventually?
Very good question. I think what was very important in 2017 and around that period in time was, first of all, the price liberalisation, and that both meant the conversion or the closing of the gap between the official and the other market exchange rate, and also price liberalisation in general. Because the basis of all reform, I think, is that you have a good price mechanism where resources are allocated in a sensible fashion, and that can only happen in the context of liberalised prices, whether we're talking of goods, services, or the exchange rate, and that was a really important underpinning which occurred then.
So the country has entered a new phase with the government announcing a new raft of reforms. A lot of them have to do with privatization. So tell us how privatization will lay the ground for the development of a sustainable economy and more growth and prosperity throughout the country.
Well, when you look at the ownership of resources across the world and in emerging markets, what we see normally is that most companies do better when they're in the private sector in the longer term, and it leads to a more efficient allocation of resources and a higher GDP per capita level. Now, in the case of Uzbekistan, right now there's significant potential for both corporate and financial sector privatization in the medium and the longer term, and the government has obviously done a lot of planning when it comes to the privatization in both sectors. That can have a really significant impact on not only the long-term pace of economic growth, but also the sustainability of economic growth, because capital will be allocated into areas which are more efficient. And that's something which is really crucial. I think another important point related to the sustainability of economic growth, and which is perhaps not discussed enough, is whether privatization can be done in an ESG friendly framework. And what I mean by that is that you could put in place key performance indicators related to key environmental and social objectives within the privatization process, which would both give clarity to strategic investors and potentially also reduce the cost of funding, both from a debt capital market perspective and obviously also improve the outcomes in terms of equity as well.
Martin, tell us a bit more about this ESG survey you have conducted recently. You've also conducted a mini one about Uzbekistan, and really, in a nutshell, it shows that for global investors, privatization that we have been discussing is key for them to start putting their money into the country.
That's right. I think if we touch on the global or emerging market ESG survey that we carried out within RBI Group, a really important point from an investor perspective is that there is considered a shortage of ESG related assets within EM high yield and also EM local currency, and it's really relevant for Uzbekistan, and it's something which the government has fully taken advantage of through its local currency international law SDG linked bonds. So that's a real connection between the two. And from a longer term perspective, it underlines that capital and inflows into emerging markets, and Uzbekistan in particular, will be stickier and longer term when there is also this ESG related angle. And in a specific Uzbek related part of the survey, which I carried out was a subset of specialist institutional investors last week, nearly half of the respondents said that they would have more flexibility to invest in Uzbek markets if there is an ESG related component to that investment, and that can be considered through the prism of ESG scoring or ratings, where perhaps you get an uplift if there is a specific ESG related component to that investment.
So you are telling us that sustainable finance could provide an entry point for investors globally?
Absolutely. It provides an entry point on the one hand, and as importantly, or more importantly should I say, it also creates a more sustainable growth path in the longer term for Uzbekistan.
Martin, finally, what do you think is the key, the success factor to make the sustainable development of Uzbekistan work and work for its people as well?
I think there's a few ingredients to success when I look at other countries in the region. One is the sheer conviction of the government to make the reforms work. And in Uzbekistan, I see a real dedication to that, which really makes a difference when I compare it to some other countries globally where there isn't necessarily always that level of conviction. Number two, obviously it needs to be inclusive, and the general population need to benefit over time. And I think if you look at what the Uzbek government is doing with their objectives, it has that specifically in mind, and that also is something which taps in, for example, to the SDG related debt issues which they've done. And the third point is, of course, good and careful planning, which is exactly also what is occurring here, with a lot of input from the real experts in supporting longer term economic growth. And the fourth and final point is having a good starting point. If I look back in the last 30 years or so across transition economies in the region, some of them had relatively vulnerable starting points. If I look at Uzbekistan right now, it's in a position with real strengths on its external balance sheet, very high FX reserves. It's got strong terms of trade in terms of its key export products having quite high prices, and it's got pretty low government debt too. So what that means is that there's a real resilience, and that creates a really good starting point for, or continuation point, shall I say, for economic growth.
Could we actually expect resilience to replace sustainability as a key term in investment communities soon?
No, I think that they are. It's two sides to the same coin, in the sense that resilience, to a certain extent, is a measure of how you respond to a shock. And we know that in the global economy in the coming years, something will happen. And resilience is then how a country can, respond to that shock and to cushion the population of that country. And if you look back at 2020, at the fact that Uzbekistan recorded, positive growth, notwithstanding the pandemic shock, that's a true sign of resilience. The sustainability relates to the longer term drivers of growth, or the level of ability to repay debt holders, both of which are also strong.
Martin, thank you very much.
Thank you.